The beeping of monitors filled the air like an unrelenting alarm, the sharp sound slicing through the tense atmosphere of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, PICU. Nurses moved frantically around the small hospital bed, their voices clipped, their hands precise as they worked to stabilize the tiny patient lying in the middle of the storm. 18-month-old Asher Lennox was burning up, his delicate body writhing against the fever ravaging him. His small chest rose and fell in erratic, shallow breaths, his pale skin glistening with sweat. The numbers on the monitor flashed a terrifying 104.7 degrees Fahrenheit, a fever so high it threatened to pull him into a dangerous seizure. His tiny fingers clenched involuntarily, his body jerking as the fever-induced convulsions overtook him. Dr. Oliver Maddox, the hospital's top pediatric specialist, rushed into the room, barely registering the chaos around him as his focus narrowed to the struggling child. His eyes flicked to the monitors, his mind already racing through the possible causes. An infection, a hidden illness, something their tests had missed. But before he could reach for the child, an unexpected force stopped him. A deep, rumbling growl. His hand froze midair. The sound didn't come from the machines, nor from the frantic whispers of the nurses. It came from the large, imposing shadow beside the hospital bed. Rogue. A massive German shepherd, his sleek black and tan coat bristling, muscles tensed like a coiled spring. He stood between Asher and the doctors, his amber eyes locked onto Dr. Maddox, with a protective intensity that sent a clear message. Do not touch him. Dr. Maddox turned sharply toward the mother standing at the bedside. Sloane Lennox, her face pale with fear, clutched her son's tiny hand in both of hers, her knuckles white. She looked from the doctor to the dog, torn between two instincts, trusting the medical professionals trying to save her son or trusting the animal that had never left his side. Sloane, Dr. Maddox's voice was firm but controlled. We need to examine Asher now. Get that dog out of here. Sloane barely had time to respond before one of the nurses, attempting to take action, reached for Rogue's collar. It was a mistake. Rogue's growl deepened, his lips pulling back just enough to flash his sharp canines. His ears pinned forward, his massive paws planted like iron pillars, unmoving. The nurse yanked her hand back immediately, heart hammering. Jesus, she whispered. Dr. Maddox was out of patience. Get that dog outside now! His voice rose over the frantic beeping, over the fevered murmurs of the medical staff. A security officer stationed outside the unit had already started toward the room, alerted by the escalating commotion. Sloane stepped forward, placing a desperate hand on Rogue's side. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. He's not trying to hurt anyone. He knows something. Please, just wait. Dr. Maddox exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He had seen his fair share of parents grasping for hope in unconventional places. He had no time for theatrics or misplaced faith in animals when a child's life was hanging by a thread. Another convulsion ripped through Asher's small body. We don't have time for this, the doctor muttered under his breath. He took another step forward, his hand extending toward Asher's chest, only to be stopped again. Not by growling this time, by something far more chilling. Without warning, Rogue lowered his head and pressed his large, wet nose directly against the center of Asher's tiny chest. He held there, unmoving. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't a warning. It was something else entirely. The entire room froze. Dr. Maddox frowned. His years of medical experience, his thousands of cases had never prepared him for something like this. The dog was pointing. Is he alerting? One of the younger nurses whispered, eyes darting between Rogue and the sick child. Sloane, her breath held painfully in her chest, nodded. He's been doing that for days, she admitted. Right there. That exact spot. Dr. Maddox blinked. That spot. Rogue's nose remained pressed to Asher's sternum, his breath slow and steady. It was deliberate, specific, unwavering. The tension in his body wasn't random. It was focus, precision. It wasn't just an act of protection. It was a message. Dr. Maddox exchanged glances with the head nurse, who seemed equally thrown off by the moment. "Move the stethoscope," he ordered, his voice quieter now, laced with something foreign, uncertainty. The nurse hesitated, then obeyed, carefully repositioning the stethoscope from the usual auscultation points down to the exact area where Rogue's nose had remained pressed. The sound that met her ears made her stomach drop. Something was wrong. The normal rhythmic lub-dub of a healthy heart sounded off, a subtle, almost imperceptible murmur. Something even an experienced physician could have missed in a routine checkup. Her eyes flicked back to Rogue. He had known before the machines. Dr. Maddox straightened, his entire demeanor shifting. "Get an echocardiogram set up, now." The nurse moved fast, calling for the necessary equipment. Dr. Maddox, meanwhile, took a step closer to Rogue, examining the way the dog remained locked on Asher. His ears had softened slightly, his tail no longer stiff with tension, but he didn't move. Not until Asher let out a tiny, feeble whimper. Then, and only then, Rogue lifted his nose away from the child's chest. His job was done. Sloane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands gripping the bed rail so tightly her fingers ached. She turned to Dr. Maddox, a storm of emotions in her eyes. "Do you still want to take him out?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. The doctor didn't answer, because for the first time in his career he found himself listening to a dog, and he had a sinking feeling that Rogue had just saved a life. Again. Before Rogue stood guard in a pediatric ICU, before he became a protector defying all odds, he was something else. A legend. A ghost. A hero no one wanted. Rogue wasn't always an unwanted K-9 with a past too heavy for any family to bear. He had once been among the elite, a distinguished member of the K-9 Special Response Unit, a division so selective that only the most skilled handlers and the most disciplined dogs were chosen. And Rogue had been one of the best. For years he had raced through disaster zones, sniffed out survivors buried under rubble, and tracked the missing through dense forests and frozen terrain. He had saved lives in ways no human ever could, detecting danger before it struck, sensing movement beneath collapsed structures, leading teams to those who had no hope left, until he found them. But one night changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a collapsed warehouse, an apparent gas explosion. Rogue had been first on the scene, his keen nose guiding him through the maze of twisted steel and crumbling debris. He found a survivor, a young boy, barely 10, pinned under the wreckage, his breaths weak. Rogue barked, signaling to his handler, Officer Elias Carter. The rescue team moved in. Then, the second explosion hit. The shockwave ripped through the night, and Elias, his best friend, his partner, his whole world, was gone. Rogue had been flung backward, his body slamming into a fallen column. He scrambled to his feet, ears ringing, lungs burning with smoke, his mind screaming for Elias's voice. But only silence answered. By the time the team pulled him from the wreckage, Rogue was left with deep wounds and a fractured leg. But the worst injury of all? Losing Elias. And something inside him broke that night. The department tried. They patched him up, ran him through retraining, assigned him new handlers, but Rogue was never the same. He became too watchful, too intense, too unwilling to let anyone go. At every sound, he flinched. Every unfamiliar voice made him tense. He refused to be separated from his assigned officers, hovering too close, scanning too much, as if waiting for the next explosion, the next moment when everything would be ripped away again. It didn't take long before the department made the call. Retirement. Not because Rogue had failed, but because he had been too good at his job. And so began the cycle of rejection. The first family who adopted him saw his commendations, his medals, his heroic service record. They believed they were bringing home a disciplined protector. Instead, they got a dog who wouldn't let their children play outside without circling them like a soldier on patrol, who blocked the father from leaving for work, standing at the door, certain something was wrong. They returned him within a week. "He's just too much," the mother had explained. The second family, a retired Marine and his wife, thought they could handle his unwavering loyalty. They admired him, until one night he physically stepped between them during an argument, mistaking raised voices for a threat. "He doesn't just protect," the husband had told the adoption officer later. "He watches, like he's always waiting for something bad to happen." The third family barely lasted 2 days. Rogue was too serious, too observant, too much. No one saw him for what he truly was, until Sloane Lennox. She had found his profile tucked away on a bulletin board at the K9 Rehabilitation Center, a laminated sheet detailing his failed adoptions, his history as a search and rescue dog, and the bold warning label at the bottom. "Best suited for experienced handlers, not recommended for families with children." That should have made her walk away, but it didn't. Instead, she looked closer. At the attached photo, Rogue, sitting in perfect obedience, his muscular frame radiating strength. But it wasn't his stance that held her attention. It was his eyes. Not anger, not aggression. Loss. A silent, unspoken grief, one she recognized. Sloane knew what it meant to lose everything. She had felt it in the cold courtroom, fighting to keep Asher safe from a man she once trusted. She had lived it in the nights spent rebuilding a life alone, constantly afraid that one day her past might find her again. She had spent years waiting for something to go wrong, and now, staring at the image of a dog who had lost everything, she understood. They were the same. That was the moment she made her decision. But when she told her mother, Eleanor Lennox, the response was swift. "A retired police dog? With that history?" "It's not just any dog," Sloane had argued. "Exactly. It's not just any dog. It's a trained working dog. This isn't a house pet, Sloane." "I don't need a house pet," she had responded evenly. "I need a protector." Eleanor's expression darkened. "And what if he turns on Asher? What if you're wrong?" Sloane held her mother's gaze. "What if I'm right?" But deep down, even she wasn't sure. She didn't know if Rogue would trust her. She didn't know if a dog trained for war could learn to live in peace. All she knew was that when she looked into those broken eyes, she saw herself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. From the moment Rogue stepped into the Lennox home, he made his decision. He was never going to leave Asher's side. Sloane had expected an adjustment period. She had prepared for it, had read every article about helping a retired K9 transition into home life. She had bought him a sturdy orthopedic dog bed, carefully arranged it in the corner of the living room, placed food and water nearby, and even left a soft blanket for him to burrow into. But Rogue never touched it. The first night, Sloane had watched him wander through the apartment, mapping every exit, every potential entry point, every single shift of light and shadow. His movements were precise, methodical, the work of a dog whose instincts had been sharpened by years of high-risk missions. And then, without hesitation, he took his post outside Asher's bedroom door. He didn't sleep, didn't curl up, didn't relax. He simply stood there, his tall frame still as stone, his ears flicking at every creak of the old floorboards, every distant honk of a car outside. It was as if he was waiting for something. Sloane had tried leading him to his bed. She had patted the cushion, called his name softly, even brought over one of his favorite treats from the adoption center. But Rogue had refused to move. Instead, he had turned his head, looked at her with those deep amber eyes, then shifted his attention back to the sleeping child behind the door. That was when she realized. Rogue had already chosen his place in this home, and it wasn't beside Sloane. It was beside Asher. By the end of the first week, Sloane started noticing something strange. Every night, after Asher had fallen asleep, Rogue would push the door open with his nose and step inside. He moved carefully, as if mindful of the small space, his large paws making no sound against the wooden floor. He would pause beside Asher's crib, lower his head, and gently press his nose to the child's chest. For a few seconds, he would stay completely still. Then, seemingly satisfied, he would retreat back to his place outside the door. At first, Sloane dismissed it as a quirk of habit. Maybe Rogue had just developed a sense of responsibility for Asher. Maybe he was simply checking in, like he would have done for a handler in the field. But then, he kept doing it, every night, without fail, even if the apartment was silent, even if there was no sound, no disturbance, even if Asher was perfectly fine. It was almost like he was monitoring something, like he was searching for something. And that was when Sloane started to wonder. What if Rogue knew something she didn't? Sloane wasn't the only one who noticed Rogue's strange behavior. Her mother, Eleanor Lennox, had already made it abundantly clear that she disapproved of bringing a retired working dog into a home with a toddler. She saw it as a risk, not a solution, a complication, not a safeguard. And the more Rogue hovered around Asher, the more unsettled Eleanor became. "This isn't normal," she remarked one afternoon, watching as Rogue positioned himself directly between Asher and the front window, blocking the child from view. Sloane, folding laundry on the couch, barely glanced up. "He's just being protective." Eleanor scoffed. "Protective is one thing, obsessive is another." Sloane sighed, setting the laundry aside. "Mom, I know you don't trust him, but Rogue hasn't done anything wrong." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Not yet." Sloane stiffened. "He's a good dog." "He's a trained tactical dog," Eleanor corrected sharply. "And that means one thing. He sees threats where there aren't any. What happens when he decides that a stranger in the grocery store is dangerous? Or worse, what if he misinterprets something and turns on Asher?" Sloane exhaled, her patience wearing thin. "He would never hurt him." Eleanor didn't look convinced. "That's what every pet owner says before something goes wrong." But Rogue didn't seem to care about Eleanor's skepticism, because that night when the power went out, he proved himself in a way no one could deny. It happened just past midnight. A sudden crack of thunder split the sky, followed by the unmistakable buzzing silence of a power failure. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the steady hum of appliances and the soft glow of nightlights all disappearing in an instant. The outage wasn't supposed to be a big deal. But Rogue reacted instantly. Eleanor, who had been staying over that night, had gotten up to find a flashlight. As she stepped into the hallway, she paused. The door to Asher's room was already open, and in the dim light filtering through the window, she saw a shadow moving inside. At first, her heart lurched, but then, as her eyes adjusted, she realized what was happening. Rogue wasn't just standing there. He was pulling the blanket over Asher, his powerful muzzle gently tucking the fabric around the child's small frame. Then, instead of returning to his usual spot by the door, he lay down beside the crib, his body curving protectively around Asher's. Eleanor didn't move, didn't breathe. She had never seen anything like it. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't training. It was something deeper, something almost human. She watched as Rogue lowered his nose to Asher's chest again, just like he always did. A few seconds passed. Then he sighed, rested his chin on his paws, and closed his eyes. He wasn't sleeping. He was waiting. Eleanor swallowed, gripping the doorframe as a realization settled deep in her chest. He wasn't protecting Asher because he was a dog trained to do so. He was protecting him because he knew something no one else did. And for the first time since Sloane had brought him home, Eleanor wondered if she had been wrong about Rogue all along. At first, Sloane told herself it was nothing. Maybe Asher was just having an off week. Toddlers went through phases, after all. They had growth spurts, sleep regressions, teething pains. But the longer she watched, the more she realized this wasn't just a phase. It started with subtle shifts. Asher, who usually woke up babbling in his crib, stayed curled under the blankets longer, his little body slower to stir. His normally bright, eager expressions dulled at the edges, his smiles fewer and further between. He laughed less, played less. His energy, which had once been endless, now seemed to flicker out within an hour of waking. By mid-morning, he would rub his tiny fists against his eyes, lean against furniture, and sometimes even reach for Sloane to be held, something he had never done before unless he was sick. But there was no fever, no cough, no runny nose, nothing obvious, nothing that made sense. And yet, Rogue knew. Before Sloane even let herself admit something was wrong, Rogue had already sensed it. It wasn't just his usual vigilance anymore. It was something else, something urgent. Sloane began noticing Rogue's behaviors changing in ways that were impossible to ignore. He paced more than usual, his sharp eyes always tracking Asher's movements. If the toddler wobbled, Rogue was already there, steadying himself beside him as if preparing to catch him. When Asher napped, Rogue stationed himself closer than ever, resting his chin on the mattress, his nose inches from the child's chest. And then there were the alerts. At first, they were gentle nudges, a press of his nose against Asher's small frame, a whine just soft enough to go unnoticed if Sloane wasn't paying attention. But over time, the nudges became insistent, and every single time it was always the same spot: his chest. The first time Sloane truly took notice, she had been sitting on the floor with Asher, folding a pile of freshly laundered baby clothes. Rogue had been lying nearby, his massive frame relaxed, but his eyes as alert as ever. Asher, nestled beside her, had suddenly slumped forward, as if too tired to hold himself up. Sloane's stomach tightened. "Hey, baby, you okay?" Asher didn't answer. Instead, he simply pressed his face into her lap, his little body going still. Before she could react, Rogue had already moved. He was beside them in an instant, his large snout pushing against Asher's chest, whining softly. Sloane frowned. "Rogue, what?" The dog did it again, pressing his nose firmly against Asher's tiny sternum. And then he whined louder. Sloane's heart lurched. "What are you trying to tell me?" she murmured, looking between her son and the dog. She placed a hand against Asher's chest, feeling the soft, steady beat of his heart. It seemed fine. Everything seemed fine. But Rogue wasn't convinced. The dog let out another frustrated sound, then tried again, firm, deliberate pressure right over Asher's heart. That night, Sloane lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had been a nurse for years. She had seen enough medical anomalies to know that sometimes the signs weren't obvious, that sometimes you had to look deeper. And if Rogue kept insisting something was wrong, then maybe, just maybe, he was right. The next morning, Sloane wasted no time. She bundled Asher into the car and drove straight to his pediatrician. She explained everything: the fatigue, the change in behavior, the way Rogue kept pressing his nose against Asher's chest like he was trying to point something out. Dr. Holloway, a kind man in his 50s with decades of experience, listened attentively, nodding as she spoke. He checked Asher's vitals, listened to his breathing, pressed his stethoscope against the toddler's tiny rib cage. Everything was normal. Lungs, clear. Heartbeat, steady. Blood pressure, fine. "There's nothing physically wrong," Dr. Holloway said, his voice reassuring. It's likely just a phase. Young children can go through periods where they seem more tired than usual. Could be a mild virus passing through or simply growth-related changes. Sloane nodded, but deep down, unease crawled under her skin. "What about his heart?" she asked. Dr. Holloway gave her a patient smile. "His heart sounds perfectly healthy." Rogue would disagree, she thought. Still, she thanked the doctor, took Asher's medical paperwork, and left the office, trying to convince herself that she was overreacting, trying to convince herself that maybe, just maybe, the professionals knew better than a dog. That night, Eleanor watched as Rogue paced the length of the living room, his tail flicking sharply behind him, his muscles wound tight like a coiled spring. It was starting to get to her, the way he wouldn't settle, the way he watched Asher like something was about to happen. She had spent weeks insisting that Sloane was making a mistake, that bringing a retired working dog into the house was a recipe for disaster. But now she wasn't so sure, especially when Rogue, always quiet, always disciplined, suddenly broke his own rules. As Sloane was putting Asher to bed, Rogue shoved his way into the nursery before she could close the door. That alone was odd, but what happened next made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. Rogue moved straight to Asher's crib, nudged the toddler onto his back, then pressed his nose against the boy's chest. And then he looked up at Eleanor. The message in his eyes was undeniable. She had ignored the signs for too long. Rogue wasn't reacting to nothing. Something was wrong. And for the first time since the dog had arrived, Eleanor spoke words she never thought she would say. "Sloane," she murmured. Her daughter turned, frowning at the unusual edge in her voice. Eleanor swallowed hard, then looked back at Rogue. "I think we need a specialist." The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the exam room, the cool air a stark contrast to the warmth of Sloane's trembling hands as she held Asher close. The little boy sat on the padded examination table, his small fingers curled tightly around the fabric of his mother's sleeve. He was quieter than usual, his normally bright eyes drooping with exhaustion. Rogue sat just a few feet away, his body tense, his amber eyes locked onto the doctor with unwavering focus. Dr. Oliver Maddox adjusted the stethoscope around his neck and pulled up a stool, his sharp gaze scanning the toddler with practiced precision. He had seen thousands of children come through his office, but this visit was different. There was an undercurrent of urgency, not just from the mother, but from the massive German shepherd who refused to take his eyes off the child. "All right, Asher," the doctor murmured, offering the boy a reassuring smile. "Let's see how you're doing today." He reached forward, pressing gentle fingers against Asher's wrist to check his pulse. The boy barely reacted. His little body swayed slightly, and Rogue instantly tensed, shifting his weight forward as if ready to act. Sloane didn't miss it. She exhaled, steadying herself, then turned to the doctor. "I know this might sound crazy, but Rogue—" She hesitated, glancing down at the dog, who remained statue still. "He's been acting differently, fixated on Asher. Every night he pushes his nose against his chest, right here." She placed her hand gently over her son's sternum. "He won't stop. He won't leave him alone." Dr. Maddox arched a brow, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. "That's unusual," he admitted. "Dogs are highly intuitive, but—" Before he could finish his sentence, Rogue moved. The dog rose from his sitting position and took 2 deliberate steps toward Asher. His ears were erect, his body poised but controlled. Then, in front of everyone in the room, he pressed his large, wet nose firmly against Asher's chest, right over his heart. The moment hung heavy in the air. Dr. Maddox froze. Rogue remained perfectly still, holding the position like a soldier awaiting orders. His breath came slow and even, his presence radiating a silent, undeniable message. "Here, right here, look." A flicker of something passed through the doctor's eyes. Uncertainty, then curiosity, then concern. The room was so quiet that Sloane could hear her own heartbeat thudding against her ribs. Dr. Maddox inhaled slowly, then picked up his stethoscope, rolling closer on his stool. His hesitation was gone now, replaced with a new kind of focus. He placed the cold metal against Asher's back first, listening intently. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Everything sounded normal. But when he moved the diaphragm of the stethoscope to Asher's chest, right where Rogue's nose had been pressed seconds earlier, his entire demeanor changed. His frown deepened. He adjusted the angle slightly, listening again. Sloane's grip on the edge of the table tightened. "What is it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Maddox didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his medical tablet and began typing notes. "I want to run an echocardiogram," he finally said. Sloane's stomach dropped. "What? Why? What do you hear?" Dr. Maddox hesitated. "There's something off." He turned toward the nurse standing by the counter. "Call cardiology. Tell them we need an immediate scan." Sloane's pulse skyrocketed. "What's wrong with my son?" Dr. Maddox met her eyes, his tone careful but firm. "I won't know for sure until we get a better look, but if I had to guess, I'd say your dog has been trying to tell you something very, very important." Rogue let out a low breath, his ears twitching slightly, as if confirming what the doctor had just said. The echocardiogram felt like the longest 20 minutes of Sloane's life. She sat in the dimly lit imaging room, Asher lying on the padded table, tiny chest rising and falling under the soft glow of the ultrasound screen. Rogue was not allowed in the imaging suite, but Sloane had seen the way he had tried to follow, the tension in his body, the quiet distress in his eyes as she had to push him back. He knew. He had known all along. Dr. Maddox and the cardiologist, Dr. Yates, stood by the screen, their faces unreadable as they examined the moving image of Asher's heart. Sloane gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the overwhelming urge to demand answers. Then, finally, Dr. Yates turned to her. "There it is," he said softly, pointing to a barely noticeable irregularity near one of Asher's heart valves. "A congenital defect. It's small, but significant. Over time, it could have worsened, possibly leading to a cardiac event." Sloane's breath caught. A defect? A heart condition? Her hands instinctively moved to Asher's tiny fingers, gripping them as though anchoring herself. But his last checkup was fine. No one ever said anything about his heart before." Dr. Yates nodded. "It would have been easy to miss during routine checkups. It's minor now, but if it had gone undiagnosed, it could have caused sudden complications." He turned to Dr. Maddox. "I have to admit, if it weren't for your dog, I doubt we would have caught this in time." Sloane felt her vision blur. She turned toward the door, knowing Rogue was out there, waiting, knowing that he had been right all along. When they finally returned to the exam room, Rogue immediately rose to his feet, tail held still, eyes locked onto Asher as if silently asking, "Is he okay?" Sloane barely made it through the door before she dropped to her knees. She reached out and took one of Rogue's massive paws in her hands, pressing it against her forehead, her body trembling. "You saved my son," she whispered. Rogue let out a quiet huff, then nudged her forward, pressing his forehead gently against her chest. It was an answer, a confirmation. He had known all along, and now, because of him, Asher was going to live. The dim glow of the hospital room's nightlight cast long shadows along the sterile white walls. The steady beeping of the monitors filled the space, a rhythmic reassurance that Asher was safe, that his heart, once a silent ticking time bomb, was now healing. Sloane sat beside her son's hospital bed, exhaustion hanging over her like a heavy fog. Asher's tiny fingers curled around hers, his chest rising and falling in soft, even breaths. The worst had passed. The surgery was successful. The doctors were optimistic. But Rogue didn't relax. The German shepherd lay on the floor near the door, his large body tense despite the quiet. His ears twitched at every distant sound. A nurse's footsteps, the beep of a machine in the hallway, the soft creak of a rolling cart. His amber eyes never strayed far from Asher, scanning the room, watching, waiting. Sloane had learned to trust Rogue's instincts. She had learned that when he was alert, there was a reason. Tonight, though, she told herself he was just being cautious. She should have known better. It started with the slightest shift in the air, a change so subtle that no human would have noticed. But Rogue did. His ears perked, his muscles tensed. A moment later, the doorknob turned. It was a slow, controlled movement, not the rushed entry of a nurse checking vitals, not the casual push of a janitor making rounds. This was something else, something wrong. The door cracked open. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a figure slipped inside. Sloane barely had time to react before a rough hand clamped over her mouth. Her body went rigid. The grip was bruising, yanking her backward before she could even let out a scream. The chair tipped over, crashing against the floor with a deafening clatter. Asher stirred, but didn't wake. And Rogue was already moving. "Shh, sweetheart," a voice hissed into her ear, dripping with cruel amusement. "Don't make a scene now." Sloane froze. She knew that voice. She hadn't heard it in 2 years, but it still haunted her nightmares. Malcolm Reed, Asher's biological father, her ex. The man who had left bruises on her skin and fear in her bones, the man she had fought to escape, the man she had spent months in court battling for full custody, the man who had sworn he'd find her again. And now, he had. Sloane thrashed against his grip, her nails clawing at his arm, but he was stronger. "Let me go!" she gasped, her voice hoarse, her heart slamming against her ribs. Malcolm laughed, a dark, guttural sound. "I told you, Sloane. I told you I'd come back for my son." Her blood ran cold. Number. He wasn't here for her. He was here for Asher. And then, Rogue lunged. Malcolm barely had time to react before 90 pounds of muscle and fury hit him like a wrecking ball. Rogue's powerful jaws snapped onto Malcolm's forearm, yanking him backward with bone-crushing force. Malcolm screamed, releasing Sloane as he stumbled back, colliding with the rolling tray of medical supplies. Instruments clattered to the floor, the sound shattering the silence of the hospital wing. Sloane scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Malcolm cursed, yanking his arm away, his face twisted in rage. "You brought a goddamn attack dog?" he spat. Rogue stood his ground, blocking the path to Asher's bed, his teeth bared in a low, menacing snarl. Malcolm's gaze flickered to the bed, to Asher, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the war unfolding around him. His expression hardened. And then, he pulled a knife from his jacket. Sloane's breath caught. The blade flashed in the dim light, its sharp edge gleaming as Malcolm gripped it tightly. Rogue didn't flinch. Malcolm lunged first. The knife arced toward Rogue's side, but the dog was faster. He dodged, snapping his jaws toward Malcolm's wrist. The man yanked back just in time, the knife slicing through the air, missing Rogue by inches. But then, Malcolm struck again. The blade plunged deep into Rogue's shoulder. Sloane screamed. Rogue let out a sharp, pained yelp, but he didn't go down. Instead, he retaliated. With a snarl that shook the walls, Rogue lunged once more, clamping down on Malcolm's arm with enough force to send him crashing to the floor. The knife clattered from his grip. Malcolm thrashed, his screams turning desperate as Rogue held him pinned, teeth sunk deep into flesh, refusing to let go. Sloane grabbed the emergency call button and slammed her fist against it. "Security!" she cried, voice breaking. "Help! There's an intruder! He has a weapon!" The alarm blared through the hospital, the shrill sound cutting through the chaos. Seconds later, footsteps thundered down the hall. A voice barked, "Let the dog go! Hands where we can see them!" Sloane's pulse pounded as hospital security flooded the room. Malcolm stopped fighting. He knew it was over. And finally, Rogue let go. Malcolm's arm was a mess of torn fabric and blood, his body shaking as security dragged him to his feet, slamming handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're done," one of the officers growled, shoving him toward the door. "You're not going anywhere but a jail cell." Sloane collapsed against the wall, her legs giving out beneath her. But she didn't care. She only cared about one thing: Rogue. The German shepherd staggered, his legs buckling beneath him. The deep, ugly wound on his shoulder bled too much, too fast. His breaths came in ragged, uneven pants. Sloane crawled toward him, her hands shaking as she cupped his face. "No," she choked out. "No, no, no, you're okay. You're gonna be okay." Rogue blinked up at her, his gaze steady despite the pain. He had done his job. He had protected Asher. And now he needed help. A nurse rushed in, already calling for the emergency veterinary team on the hospital's support staff. As the medics arrived, as Rogue was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, as Sloane pressed her forehead against his and whispered over and over again, "You saved him. You saved us," she made a silent promise. No matter what it took, she was going to save him too. Rogue's recovery, the making of a legend. The hospital waiting room felt colder than it should have. Sloane sat hunched over, hands clasped tightly together, staring at the door where Rogue had disappeared hours ago. He was in surgery, fighting for his life. And all she could do was wait. Eleanor sat beside her, uncharacteristically quiet. She had spent so much time doubting, questioning, resisting the idea of Rogue being part of their lives. But now she was praying for him to come back. The dog she had once feared had saved them all. A soft shuffle of footsteps made Sloane snap her head up. A veterinarian in surgical scrubs stepped into the waiting room, his expression neutral but not grim. "The surgery was successful," he said, and Sloane nearly collapsed in relief. "He'll need time to heal, weeks of careful rest and rehabilitation." But the vet hesitated, glancing at her, almost as if he didn't believe what he was about to say. Even while coming out of anesthesia, he kept trying to move, like he had somewhere to be. Sloane already knew where. They brought Rogue into the hospital room hours later, his massive frame weak but still strong-willed. Bandages covered his shoulder, and an IV line trailed from his foreleg, but his eyes searched the room until they found Asher. With a quiet whimper, Rogue did something that made every nurse watching pause. He crawled. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself closer to Asher's hospital bed. Sloane gasped, moving to stop him, but Eleanor placed a hand on her arm. "Let him," she whispered. Rogue, using every ounce of his strength, reached the edge of Asher's bed and pressed his nose against the boy's chest, right over his heart. A moment later, he sighed and rested his head on the mattress. He had checked, and he had made sure. Asher was safe. Only then did Rogue finally close his eyes, surrendering to rest. Officer Daniel Hayes arrived the next day, bringing news that left everyone in shock. Rogue wasn't just any K-9, he explained. He was part of a classified program, a medical detection unit focused on early heart disease diagnosis. Sloane's breath hitched. What? The program was cut before it could be fully implemented, Hayes continued. Budget issues, lack of research support. But Rogue? He had already learned how to detect cardiac irregularities. That's why he fixated on Asher. That's why he wouldn't leave him alone. Sloane's mind reeled. He hadn't been overprotective. He had been trained to save lives. And he had done exactly that. Rogue's story spread across the country within days. News outlets picked it up, dubbing him the guardian dog. People donated money for his recovery. Messages poured in from families who had lost loved ones to undiagnosed heart conditions, saying, "If only we had a dog like Rogue." And soon, that became a possibility. The hospital partnered with the K9 unit to create the Guardian K9 program, a revolutionary initiative to train medical alert dogs to detect early heart conditions in children. Rogue was the first. He was the blueprint, and just like that, a dog who had once been deemed too much, who had been rejected, abandoned, and misunderstood, became a legend. Sloane sat beside Rogue's bed, running her fingers gently through his fur as he slept. He was healing. So was Asher. And so was she. Sloane sat hunched over, hands clasped tightly together, staring at the door where Rogue had disappeared hours ago. He was in surgery, fighting for his life, and all she could do was wait. Eleanor sat beside her, uncharacteristically quiet. She had spent so much time doubting, questioning, resisting the idea of Rogue being part of their lives. But now she was praying for him to come back. The dog she had once feared had saved them all. A soft shuffle of footsteps made Sloane snap her head up. A veterinarian in surgical scrubs stepped into the waiting room, his expression neutral but not grim. "The surgery was successful," he said, and Sloane nearly collapsed in relief. "He'll need time to heal, weeks of careful rest and rehabilitation." But the vet hesitated, glancing at her, almost as if he didn't believe what Eleanor, sitting across the room, exhaled deeply. "I was wrong about him," she admitted. "I was afraid of what I didn't understand." Sloane nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. "Sometimes, the things we fear the most are the very things that save us." Eleanor reached out, placing a hand on Rogue's paw. "And sometimes," she whispered, "we don't find heroes. They find us." This story is a testament to the power of loyalty, resilience, and the quiet redemption found in second chances. Rogue was more than a protector. He was a survivor, a soul shaped by loss, but unwilling to abandon those who needed him most. He proved that true guardianship is not about strength alone, but about sacrifice, trust, and an instinctive devotion that defies logic. In saving Asher, he reclaimed his own purpose, and in choosing him, Sloane learned a profound truth. Sometimes the things we fear most are the very things that lead us to salvation. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.